The power of documentary photography shines through in this photographer's work, unlike so many other pieces created in the genre. This piece, dedicated to a chemical disaster that devastated a region and its people, speaks to the importance of this type of photography and how we should consider taking on documentary photography work ourselves, even if it's being done on a much less dramatic scale, for the sake of creating photos that stand out, speak to people, and say something new in a time when so much less meaningful photography is being created on a daily basis. This is Insight for Inspiration, W. Eugene Smith, Minamata. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation. Minimata is a project W. Eugene Smith created long after he left Life magazine, but it was created as a kind of response to everything he felt was wrong about the publication and a lot of photojournalism in general. To create this work, he and his wife Eileen spent 3 years in Minamata, Japan. An environmental disaster happened in the location because a chemical manufacturer called the Chizo Corporation had poured untreated waste into Minamata Bay for over 30 years, beginning in 1932. This caused all of the fish in the bay to become contaminated with mercury. Since this fish was the cornerstone of the diet for the people of Minamata, there was an outbreak of neurological symptoms, blindness, seizures, sensory disorders, coma, and death. In terms of his feelings about the photojournalism he sought to pursue in Minamata, Smith said, "My belief is that my responsibilities within photojournalism are two. My first responsibility is to the subjects. My second responsibility is to my readers. I believe that if I fulfill these two responsibilities, I will automatically have fulfilled my responsibilities to the magazine." The devastation caused by this event is what drew W. Eugene Smith to document it. He felt that although everyone was supposedly already aware of the impacts of pollution, they still chose to remain ignorant to the ruin that could lie in its wake. Not only did we find that it was not finished, but we became convinced that it, whether the poison is mercury, or asbestos, or food additives, or traditions, or something else, is closing more tightly upon us each day. Pollution growth is still running far ahead of anti-pollution conscience. But what we also found in Minamata was the kind of courage and stubbornness that can encourage other threatened people not only to refuse to give in, but also to work at righting their own situation. His hope was that this book could act as a way to send that message and prove that photojournalism could have an impact on many of the problems being faced in the world. Minamata is made up of a number of small villages that are connected by a central downtown area. Smith described it as having a peaceful seaside atmosphere. The Chizo Corporation built its factory in 1907, after signing a deal that the leaders of Minamata felt would bring them prosperity, as many of those who inhabited the region were poor fishermen. 2 decades later, Chizo was paying small amounts to cover damages that they were making to the land and water, because they felt it was better to pay off these fishermen than to change their practices that were having a negative impact on the environment. Chizo had a strong reputation for creating quality goods, so the government stood behind them and the decisions that they made. In the 1930s, they began to produce plastics that required mercury for production. Then, an odd sickness began to show up in Minamata, but members of the region didn't know it was the fish they were consuming that was causing it. As a result, they referred to the issues plaguing their citizens and their cats as the strange disease. In the early 50s, as Chizo grew, so did the population of Minamata, until it reached its zenith of 50,000 people. It wasn't until 1953 that the first case of what became known as the Minimata Disease was reported. In April of 1956, several children began to be admitted to the hospital after losing their abilities to walk, to speak, and showing signs of brain damage through episodes of delirium. Neighbors reported how cute and smart the children had been before they fell ill. From then on, many more people caught the disease, and many noticed that nearly all the village's cats had died. But there was still a ton of confusion over what was causing these problems. The next month, the Chizo Company doctor began to investigate what was happening, and eventually established that it was the company he worked for that had caused what was leading to this outbreak. Chizo reacted by spinning counter-narratives of anything else they believed to be the cause, to push the blame off onto something else. For years, Chizo would work to deconstruct new narratives that they were to blame. Once it became undeniably clear to Chizo, but not to the general public, the company sought out victims and negotiated contracts that would give them a small settlement and relieve them from any further responsibilities through their knowledgeable lawyers that preyed on their ignorant victims. Once it came to light that Chizo was behind the disease, the fishermen briefly fought back, only to be persuaded by the mayor that they should take what they can get. What they got was a small payment and an agreement that there would be no cleanup of the region by Chizo. It wasn't until the late 60s that Chizo found themselves wrapped up in a court case that lasted for 4 years, and once they were found guilty of poisoning the water, they changed their methods. Smith closes this section outlining the events that caused the travesty by stating, Chizo raped the fishermen's water of Minamata Bay and caused great sickness. At first, perhaps, from ignorance and carelessness, but afterwards from arrogance, greed, and what could even be called industrial genocide. He goes from there to speculate how many people have already, and could eventually be, impacted by the fish of Minamata Bay, citing a university study from the time that found the number could be around 10,000. According to a Science Direct article published in 2007, ultimately, more than 50,000 were affected, with more than 2,000 unequivocally having what became known as Minimata Disease. When Smith began this project, he had a meeting with the heads of Chizo. They all answered his questions in a pleasant manner, while trying to make the company appear to not be all bad, even though there was clearly no evading the fact that they were responsible for the disease. According to Smith, even today, most Minamata citizens sympathize with Chizo. Some fervently defend the company. Others feel that Chizo, even if guilty, has taken too much of a beating. The majority seem to suffer silently in a mixture of complicated feelings. Yet the citizens know, despite recent cutbacks at the factory, that Minamata has prospered because of Chizo. As the mayor said in 1973, just before he won his second term in office, what is good for Chizo is good for Minamata. Anecdotes from W. Eugene Smith and Eileen further expand on these complicated feelings. Individuals of the community would treat them in a completely different manner depending on the situation they were in. Many felt that the hostility towards Chizo wasn't the best way of dealing with what had happened, and those who still had the true inner feelings of wanting to put up a fight refused to do so because of how they would look within their society. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation, a plugin to help photographers and videographers achieve the look of film through digital means within the following software. For more information on how Dehancer can help you achieve the look of film on your frames by adding authentic and tested looks, compression, grain, halation, bloom, and more, check the link in the description. Overall, this section of the writing humanizes the people of Minamata in a way that leaves you feeling for them and wondering what you yourself might do in a given situation. The words of this section are better left in W. Eugene Smith's own voice, to give you a greater sense of the power of this document and how much more powerful it may have felt when it was released 50 years ago. He wrote, "The walls of the crude isolation wards, into which a frightened town thrust its first sick and dying victims of Minamata disease, are demolished, gone. The dead, for those of us who came later, are, as it were, forgotten. Shadows from what we have been told are our only source of memory. We never knew the flesh of their laughter or their angry shouts, and so we find nothing amiss in the silence. Today, if you have the courage to reach out to the child poisoned in the womb, across the barrier of a twisted body, across the barrier of slurred and non-existent speech, you find yourself groping towards the being that does live, however, behind the barrier. Envision as you may, though you cannot project the child normal and whole, you cannot project the child that might have been, the child not struck by poison. The child itself, can that child even have recollections of a beginning? That child is an island we have no way to comprehend. The urgent crisis of a bedridden man, his loving wife caring for him, it becomes, with time, a boring drudgery. And when the man and his wife look into each other's eyes, the healthy days together are too often forgotten. All these memories slip into the dark so swiftly, so quietly, that already they are lost, or will soon be lost forever. But we must wake up. We must miss something in what we see of the poisoned child. The couple making a last long turn. Somewhere in our minds, we must feel an aching vacancy. When Eileen and I held our hands to the diminutive, exhumed skull of an 8-year-old victim, who would be 25 if she had lived, we tried to remember as clearly as if it had been our own experience, how alive this child of 8 once was. Despite the mixed emotions in Minamata, there were those who wanted to fight back. Smith talks about them in the chapter titled Flags of Vengeance. This group was made up of those of a new generation affected by Minamata disease. Chief among them was a man named Kawamoto, and he led the charge to draw national awareness to the issue. According to Smith, the rage of the patients had to be felt, not only by patients, but by the whole nation. They needed the notoriety that their supporters brought them, as well as sympathy, to keep a spotlight on Chizo and keep their uprising alive. The snapping of flags in the wind, the chants of marching supporters, the sometimes outrageous demonstrations, these finally truly crept into the conscience of a nation. This was a cry from the wounded that was not to be smothered. Kawamoto was part of a gathering of hundreds of new supporters who looked to get what they truly deserved out of Chizo, instead of the small amounts of hush money previously pushed on the older generations of victims. To ensure their voices were heard, they placed a tent in front of Chizo headquarters, along with fences lined with photos of those impacted by the disease. They did this to remain in sight and mind of Chizo at all times. The setup was constantly monitored by someone in the group and never forcibly dismantled, because Chizo feared what the negative press would bring upon them. Prior to his experience of standing against Chizo, the issue of Minamata disease was something that had plagued Kawamoto's life. When he was younger, he had become convinced that his father died of the disease, exhumed his remains, took them for an autopsy, and was never given a result. After this, he began traveling daily by bicycle from his home to villages that were up to 2 hours away, meeting with every family he could find, who he believed might have been affected by the disease. Over time, he became convinced that the disease had impacted far more people than was previously thought. But when he filed the paperwork for correct bodies to investigate this further, he was rejected multiple times until he finally succeeded in 1971. From there, Kawamoto built a loyal following of protesters who remained persistent in their pursuit of Chizo. They got attention from the press for a while, but that slowly diminished. Regardless, the loyalists stayed by his side and continued to fight. Later on, an incident happened at one of the plants where Kawamoto and other patients were supposed to have an organized meeting with Chizo heads. The situation became chaotic and led to Smith being attacked and having his cameras destroyed while trying to photograph what was going on. He responded by stating, "Chizo had set us up. They by damn were going to intimidate the patients and take care of that foreign journalist. I'll stake my life that no 3 o'clock call was intended. They had made a serious mistake." The beating of a respected American journalist loosed an avalanche of unfavorable publicity upon Chizo, and it gave increased respectability to Kawamoto and the Minamata cause. If Chizo were really like this, people said, maybe the patients were right. If I had to suffer the injury, I took consolation in the fact that it increased nationwide sympathy for the patients. From there, Kawamoto and his people continued to struggle with Chizo for a period of time. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into all the details here, other than to say that nothing dramatically changed until a trial took place in the late 60s. At that time, another city experienced a similar situation as what had happened in Minamata, with another chemical company putting mercury into their water. In order to investigate what was happening, they went to Minamata to find out more about what had happened there. This, according to Smith, inspired a rebirth of spirit among patients in Minamata, a feeling that they must face up to their situation. After repeated disagreements among themselves and evasions by Chizo, one group found itself forced into a desperate move. 29 families representing 45 victims launched a lawsuit against the company. A number of factors came through in the trial, but the testimony of Chizo engineer Nishida appears to have been the biggest factor. Though he had likely known since 1959 that Chizo's wastewater was the cause, he kept it silent until lawyers forced him to testify shortly before his death in 1969. His testimony was one of the most damning against the company. Ultimately, his internal conflict between loyalty to Chizo and responsibility to public health highlights the devastating human toll of corporate silence. Chizo made the statement that summarized their defense for public relations that, needless to say, in a lawsuit, it's a critical point whether you are legally responsible for the disease or not. We, of course, could not foresee that the effluent from our plant might cause Minamata disease. Furthermore, we exerted our utmost effort to take the best measures for the treatment of the effluent from time to time as suitable. Therefore, we believe that we committed no fault or omission so far as the legal responsibilities are concerned. Moreover, a reconciliation agreement was concluded in 1959 and still remains in force. In this connection, we believe it reasonable to insist that we are not legally responsible for the disease. The trial moved on until January 1972, when in Smith's words, the court came to Minamata for a grueling week-long session. The judge, his associates, and his staff truly earned my respect during this time. It was a time for the patients to testify in their own setting. In suffocating heat, the judge, the lawyers, the supporters, and plaintiffs crowded the small homes. They heard years of suffering summed up in questions and answers. The intensity was almost too much to take. Witness after witness tore down the dams of privacy. They brought forth their shames, their sorrows, their hatreds, their sufferings, their fears. They laid bare their hearts and minds, and their years of desperation. At times, it became so intimate that all but the court officials had to leave. And still, it was clear that even this flood of words could not recreate the tragedies. The uphill battle that the people of Minamata faced was finally won once the verdict was reached in 1973. They were awarded a maximum of $68,000 for anyone who had passed away as a result of the disease, and a minimum of $60,000 for any injuries less serious than death. Later on, they claimed to have allowances to cover the medical bills that they would have to continue to pay after being affected by the disease, which they also won. By early 1975, Chisel would pay out indemnities of more than $80 million. The remaining chapters of the book go on to discuss how different people affected by the disease attempted to move on. Even with the financial settlements reached, the disease still continued to plague their lives in various ways. Eugene Smith closed it by stating, "The tragedy of Minamata Disease will remain. There can be no true victory for any of the factions involved in the legal or moral confrontations. At most, for the victims, and for those who care for them, a measure of financial relief may have been achieved." Historians might find in Minamata the healthiest roots of a new industrial revolution. Looking back, they might find that from this arena emerged the strongest realization that industry has no divine right to pollute in the name of gross national product. They might find, if humankind ever decides to assume true responsibility for its stewardship of the planet, that they are looking back into a kind of soul force of courage, a force that might save our children from the plunders that began with the first industrial revolution. Minimata is a profound piece of photojournalism. The book is so powerful and shows how important photography can be when the cameras are focused on the correct subject matter. Anyone looking to take documentary photography more seriously should look to this work as a key source of inspiration. Thanks to Dehancer for sponsoring this video. If you want to know how to use their plugin to get the look of film on your digital photo and video, check the link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep developing.